the completion agenda, and performance funding. A conversation with Kevin Dougherty, Chip Hatcher, and Nate Johnson. Where is the U.S. in terms of performance funding in higher education?
I think what strikes me is how rapidly the conversation is evolving, where we not only have a fair number of states are engaging in performance funding, even a fair number are talking about engaging it. Many different national are talking about how this is a good thing to do. There's strong support from the federal government. So there's certainly a convergence of interest that one would not have seen, even 5 years ago. And I think that has definitely put it on the policy agenda.
What's maybe different this time around is that it's happening in the context of pretty steep budget cuts rather than as an adjunct to budget increases in the past, a way of allocating incremental new funding. It's being phased in even along with or as part of budget reductions.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. That's a key new part of it. I think the thing I think we're going to have to see how it plays out is that may certainly take it in a new direction and may actually increase the number of states involved, but there are also reasons to believe that long-term budget problems also make it hard to maintain performance funding, even if it's embedded in the regular funding formula. So it'll be very interesting to see over the next few years whether the current effort to increase it will be able to sustain itself, or will have a return to something like what happened before of a number of states abandoning it. I don't think that'll be the case, but it's hard to tell at this point.
Yeah, on the one hand, you have the historic tendency of institutions and states to resist performance funding or to put it on the back burner or make it the first thing to go when there's a budget cut. But I think this time around there's some hope, and it kind of remains to be seen whether it works out, that paying closer attention to completion and being willing to accept some level of performance funding will help shore up support among policymakers, legislators, governor's offices for higher education, that they would be more willing to provide a higher level of support overall to the system if they see that they're responding to a results-oriented funding process than they would if everyone were just playing defense and refusing to look at that.
Why were attempts at performance funding abandoned in the past?
Well, when it got abandoned before, it was typically a confluence of circumstances, but one of the most important would be state funding for higher education might have flattened out or dropped. And at that point, it became important. At that point, if there was a lot of institutional resistance to performance funding and concern about defending their regular state funding, there might be a push to abandon performance funding or a lack of support for it. So the current situation then makes it a little hard to figure out what will be the long-term trajectory of the total amount of state support for higher education. What's the attitude of the institutions towards performance funding now? Do they see it as something useful? Do they also see it, as Nate was just saying, as a key support for them in a time of fiscal stringency? This is a way of making the case for state funding for them. So I think there's probably a change in attitude on the part of higher education institutions, but it's not entirely clear what the trajectory of that attitude will be. And I think it's still rather unclear what the long-term trajectory of state finances is going to be. So that combination makes it, I think, somewhat hard to predict. But I think the sense that we may be in a different situation now than was the case, let's say, 10 years ago. I think there's a lot to argue for the difference in circumstances.
I think too. I mean, there's been a long, slow shift, in fits and starts really, but over the long term, a relatively slow shift from state support to student-supported higher education through tuition. And it seems like once that gets to a certain point, it's one thing to have the performance funding conversation when the large majority of funding is state appropriated, but when it's derived from tuition, which in a sense is enrollment-based funding, the performance that's being rewarded is credit hours and enrolling students. Then, if a relatively small part of the overall mix is state funding, you could almost say that what is the role of that remaining vestigial funding, and maybe the appropriate role for that is the completion bonus or the incentives for things that aren't incentivized through the operating business of the institutions, which would generate money primarily through enrollments and grant funding.
What are some lessons learned from states implementing performance funding, and what does performance funding 2.0 look like?
Well, from up close, I've been fairly impressed with the process and the end product in Tennessee, with the formula and the overall organizational effort to do performance funding in that state. But I'm curious what someone like Kevin, who hasn't been as close to one particular state as I have, what your perspective, whether you think Tennessee has gotten it more right than other places, or if there maybe is a better example that I'm less familiar with.
I think I share your perspective. I think they've certainly gone at it very carefully. The indicators and measures are carefully worked out, and I think I've been particularly impressed by the process, which has been, it's within a context of pretty extensive consultation between the coordinating board and the institutions, so that, and things were worked out over time. So the fact that the process was not therefore very quick, relatively minimal consultation, possibility of a lot of institutional resistance or feeling that the measures and indicators that were now being applied were not ones that they'd had much of a chance to be able to inform. These are all the things I think that often can lead to, if you don't do that well, to later demise of a system. The fact that Tennessee went at this, I think, carefully and systematically, and the indicators, I think, have a lot of validity, I think bodes well for the system. I think the thing I certainly am very interested in looking at, is that we don't yet fully understand how a 2.0 system will work out. I think there's a lot of good sense that this may be a very interesting direction to go, but since this is all fairly new, I think we'll be having to watch very carefully. In my own research, we'll be looking, current researchers will be on looking at the implementation of these systems in Tennessee and Ohio. And I'll be very interested in seeing how this all plays out. I think the initial indications are very good, but there's always room for surprise as to, things appearing that you hadn't quite anticipated. But I would certainly say that Tennessee does strike me as a very interesting example and indication of what maybe could be done.
One of the things that I think is good news for Tennessee, but concerns me about the national picture, is that what seems like has been required there and has worked out is a combination of competency on the part of the state level administrators, both technically in terms of the fiscal and data aspects of the formula, and politically too, being able to do that kind of negotiation and the way they brought the business community on board, and the business community in turn was able to sustain support for the effort across a gubernatorial transition that also involved a party switch, which was a fairly impressive political feat that I think corresponds to some of the technical virtuosity of the formula itself. But what that means for other states, how many states can replicate that level of capacity and competence with their coordinating boards or their governing boards, especially since in a lot of states there's the agencies that would be doing performance funding or could be asked to do 2.0 are being weakened or dismantled. Florida, California most recently, Washington State. I think there are probably a handful of others where even if you had the right theory about performance funding and the right approach to it, it's completely unclear who would develop it and put it in place.
I think that's very well put.
How important is a state's organizational capacity to implementing performance funding?
And Tennessee is probably fairly heavy on state level higher education administrative staff. I mean, the Higher Education Commission, the two governing boards, they have a fairly deep bench relative to the size of the state, and I think they needed that to do what they were able to do. That wasn't something that had the kinds of thick description quality aspects that you might want in a more complex formula that would require even more capacity, I think, at the state level. So the question, I think, is, who's going to do it?
Yeah. And the capacity then, because I think underlying what we've just been talking about is it's certainly technical capacity, political capacity, and also, I don't want to call it like a kind of a social capacity, relying on relationships of trust and communication that have been built over a long period of time. So the Higher Education Coordinating Board in Tennessee has had long-standing interactions and relationships with the institutions where a lot of things have been built up, thought through, understandings reached. That takes a long time to build, and a lot of states don't have it. It would take them a long while to do it. Even if they were to quickly build up their technical capacity, building up those relationships of trust aren't going to flow immediately. So I think Nate's point about the particularities of the situation in Tennessee is very important. And what I'd be concerned is certain states jumping into this very quickly and imposing a system far too quickly before they've been able to build up, in effect, this technical, social, political infrastructure.
What are other concerns or cautions for states implementing performance funding?
Arizona and Iowa, which have very similar structures or lack thereof, they've got boards of regents that govern three institutions each, in each case, a university of, a state, and a northern, and then community colleges that aren't coordinated under a single board or only have very loose state level coordination. And I think that is a situation where the question is, if you're going to do performance funding, who's going to do it, and can you have a self-policed or self-instituted performance funding model? I'm not sure that you can, but I'm willing to be proved wrong if I see one.
Particular thing that I've been concerned about is that to be done well, I think performance funding has to be done very carefully. As any other kind of, in effect, steering or directional device, you can often have consequences that you don't anticipate. And I would like to see if more attention to what the obstacles could be, the unintended consequences, and thinking about policy design is having to think about all of those very carefully and begin to build in ways of mitigating or counteracting some of these problems. I think we still sometimes there's a tendency to sort of see it as unalloyed good rather than a powerful but potentially problematic instrument. And so I think in the part of state policymakers particularly, how to convey to them the kind of carefulness with which they need to approach it. I think I would certainly like to see more of that.
In a recent article, Deborah Humphreys expressed concern that the completion agenda does not adequately emphasize the assessment of learning. With that in mind, do you think assessment can be factored into performance funding 3.0?
If we're talking about, well, the traditional enrollment-based formula, not where the incentive is for enrollment, at that, if we were to call that 1.0, though, I think that's what I'm a little concerned about is that already you're having people talking about 1.0, 2.0. I think of what Brenda Albright has been doing, and we get confused at this point. But if a fundamental distinction is between performance funding as a bonus over and on top, the regular, usually formula-based state funding, 2.0 is one that embeds the performance funding indicators within that formula itself, because there's a concern that otherwise performance funding as a bonus is subject to easily being dropped. If you're not proposing 3.0, that in effect takes that even further by bringing in learning assessment. We certainly have a good number of states that have done 1.0 in the terms of a bonus. We have a number of states that are doing 2.0. The key difference is not so much in the indicators, but in a way is it treated as embedded in the formula or as a bonus. 3.0 would move us into something really quite different, and that is into the area of learning assessment. And that, I think, is a huge change, one that certainly is in the offing. But if we're already talking about the political and technical complications of 2.0 in terms of how many states can go about it as carefully as Tennessee has, the technical and political and other complications of moving towards learning assessment, particularly if you're attaching funding outcomes to that, those will be enormous. And I think we'd have to think very carefully before we jump into that, before I think we've even fully understood and assimilated 2.0.
Do you think that states need to get performance funding 2.0 right before they can address the issue of quality assessment brought up by Deborah Humphreys?
I was very sympathetic to her argument because certainly one of the things that's been on my mind is that any performance funding system, and perhaps one that really has real muscle behind it, as let's say a 2.0 system would, does create a strong temptation to engage in a variety of practices, whether advertently or not, that are problematic, like a weakening of academic standards. And I would also, by the way, point very strongly to my concern that mass access institutions like community colleges will be very strongly pushed in the direction of becoming more selective, which is, I think, of great concern at a time when we're concerned about, access and opportunity in this country. But that said, at the point you're really stepping into, with learning assessment, you're really stepping into the very core of how the institutions are working. This is something I think that there's been much discussion. I don't think yet a lot of consensus. It would have to be handled very carefully, and the kind of dialogue that you need with faculty and students who are spread across a variety of different institutions and disciplines. This is a very complicated task, and I think we should be going in this direction, but I don't see it as good or safe to do it really quickly, and I don't think it's going to be anything but simple.
I guess I have two kind of contradictory responses to this model of performance funding. On the one hand, I do think that the quality issue is absolutely central, and without it, the completion by itself is fairly meaningless without some quality component to the to what a degree or a credential is, and so I don't think it's sort of a side issue. I think in some ways it is the issue. On the other hand, the idea that we would be moving to that we're moving to a system in which we don't pay enough attention to quality kind of implies that we're moving away from a system in which we do pay adequate attention to quality. And I'm not sure that's the case. I mean, we have a system now in which we kind of have an unchecked reward system around credit hours and enrollments, which has, you know, incentives that are just as perverse or more perverse than one that places a lot of emphasis on completion. And I think we've seen the consequences of that, and in some ways that's a lesson for how you know, what can happen with a performance funding system is you get all kinds of behaviors to maximize enrollments and butts in seats and retention without a whole lot of attention to finishing and you know, as well as some positive behaviors too, is, you know, with it's been successful as far as growing access over the last century. I mean, that's a huge accomplishment, along with the negative side effects. But you know, I don't think we. I worry that we wait to emphasize completion until, or we're lobbied to wait until we have every quality issue nailed down perfectly before we start paying some attention to completion in our funding systems.
Are there assumptions embedded in the performance funding discussion relative to the issue of quality?
So I think there are a few embedded assumptions behind most of the performance funding push that have implications for this part of the conversation. One is that there's sort of an overarching assumption that when you include some measure of performance, like completions into the formula, that we're going to get more of it, that institutions will find a way to get more. And I'm sort of reminded of, I think Nate was the one that, I'm paraphrasing Dennis Jones, I think, and that it was a comment that was something like, well, we pay for enrollments now, and look at how good institutions are at giving us enrollments. So there's this assumption that, like, once institutions have the incentive to do something, that they'll figure out ways to do it. And I think that the issue that Deborah is implicitly addressing is that sometimes it's really hard to figure out what to do, and sort of the easiest lever that you'd have, I mean, I think this is an assumption too, that the easiest lever that an institution is going to have is to decrease quality. I'm not sure that that's true any more than the first assumption is true. But it also strikes me that some of the conversations that got us to performance funding 2.0, and some of the stuff that Professor Dougherty's talking about with respect to having the right conversations and having the right sort of political environment to talk about these things, are bringing faculty to the table that might have some of these issues at the fore of their minds. So on some level, if I can be optimistic for a second, you can sort of think about performance funding 3.0 as a continuation of those conversations, right? So that if there were people at the table when the conversation about 2.0 was happening that worried about perverse incentives, then then an improvement upon the formulas that take those perverse incentives into account might look like what Deborah is talking about in her article. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense.
There are, I think Kevin was saying something like this, but there are two ways that you can do introduce the quality checks into a performance funding system. One is to have direct measures of learning outcomes or other quality practices, high impact practices, and give those some kind of a factor in the formula itself. The other way is to make those part of the degree standards, so that degrees themselves have to meet certain standards to be considered valid degrees, or degrees worth providing additional funding for. And it might be the latter that would, really you don't want to only address the quality issue in the context of ongoing performance funding conversations. It's something that you'd like to address, I would think, in American higher education more generally. So ideally, we would have a system in which you didn't have to worry about the quality of a credential when you gave it some weight in a funding formula.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense.
So one thing that I've heard people talking about is or asking is whether the current whether the faculty-driven model of curriculum and academic governance, which we've entrusted more or less with safeguarding the quality of a credit hour-based system. I mean, to the extent that is working, and I think in a lot of ways it does. I mean, I don't think whatever concerns and examples and cases that you can point to that are out there. I mean, I think there's a lot of very high quality higher education going on out there, and it's going on mostly under a system of faculty governance. With to the extent that that's working, and that faculty are resisting the fairly considerable pressures that come from an enrollment-driven system or a tuition-driven system, would that necessarily collapse just because we start placing more emphasis on completion? I mean, in some ways you have to have a fairly poor opinion of faculty and administrators to think that they would just, start diluting the quality of degrees. And I'm not sure that that's fair to those people.
Yeah, that's a great point, Nate. And I think, I think the alternative question to ask, right, is does that system, is it even responsive? Is it eventually going to be responsive to the performance funding initiative, right? If we're reasonably confident that it's not going to collapse in terms of quality control, then do we think that it will respond to these incentives that institutions have? Nate was making the case that we've got sort of a system of faculty autonomy that wouldn't collapse, that wouldn't compromise quality control. And so I guess I'm asking the alternative question: if institutions are rewarded based on the number of students they complete, will that same faculty autonomy prevent prevent the sorts of innovation that or improvements that are hoped for through those sorts of initiatives. I mean, there's an assumption that things will change, that these institutions will respond to the new incentives. And I guess Nate was making the case that they won't respond in perverse ways. And the more general question is whether or not they will respond at all, or to what extent they will respond.
Are institutions actually responding to the completion agenda?
Well, I think you're already seeing a fair amount of response. I think the completion agenda, with or without the funding attached to it, sometimes it's just highlighting the data and publishing embarrassing completion rates and raising the profile of the issue is enough to focus people's attention with or without the funding. But most faculty that I know, even at research universities, are very concerned with student success, and some of them are fairly appalled when they see the data and what's going on at their institutions and others. And they do want students to succeed, and they tend to find where their interests and aspirations intersect with those of legislatures and policymakers. Even if there's not a whole lot of love lost between the two constituencies, when they do start thinking about the issues, they do come up with some creative solutions, and as do college presidents and other administrators. So, I mean, you see things like the kinds of remedial education reform that Complete College America is advocating and that have been put in place in various places around the country, and there's pretty good evidence that's very successful, and having courses in which the model is not remediation followed by a college level course, where the completion rates are very low when you take into account the failure rates in the remedial course, the failure to rematriculate in a college level course, even if you do succeed, and then the failure rates in the college level course. You have 3 opportunities to drop out there, and if you instead supplement the college level course with additional co-curricular remedial instruction, you get much better success rates, and that's something that will improve completion rates, be less expensive in the long run, especially on a cost per degree kind of basis, and will serve students a lot better. And there are a number of examples like that you can point to where the emphasis on completion is driving reforms that are not just cheaper, but also, I think, fairly clearly better for students.
Yeah, and I think the point you're raising then that a lot of this can bring faculty attention to the issue, engage faculty, and faculty will often be willing to be engaged, I think is important because there is the danger in some of these discussions of treating faculty as, in effect, more recalcitrant than they really are. There certainly are faculty fears because as we step deeper into the instructional process, you're getting at the very center of what faculty do and what they care about and how they define themselves. But I think if there are ways of engaging them in that conversation, I think there's a lot they can and will add. So I think it's thinking about structures of consultation are really important here. And that's why I keep coming back to the whole issue of process, because I think that's key to this. Let me add one more thing that I think is important, and I wonder what folks think about this as well. The model underlying a lot of performance funding or performance accountability is I don't think it necessarily puts at the center enough the whole notion of organizational learning, which is individuals, groups, institutions may come to realize that their performance isn't good enough, but they may have a devil of a time figuring out where precisely is the problem and what might be possible solutions, and how do you determine whether a solution is working or not. So building up the capacity of the organizations to engage in that organizational learning, I think, is crucial. And what has struck me is that there hasn't been that much discussion about that in most discussions about performance funding. So I think getting some attention to that is crucial, and I think that's why states such as Tennessee and Florida, for example, interest me, because they spend a lot of time on that kind of work. And this, I think, may be very crucial to thinking about how to get more effective responses to the completion agenda.
Can you talk about Florida and Tennessee in terms of organizational learning?
In Florida, I mean, we don't really have performance funding to speak of here. There was a bit of it at the community college level for a while, but the structures that at the state level that do keep a lid on some efficiency issues and that have also been very valuable opportunities for faculty and administrators to network, and including some of the things that have been forced on the system by legislation and state administrative rules, like the common course numbering system and the degree program limitation requirements that every bachelor's degree be 120 credit maximum requirement unless there are specific exceptions, and general education transfer. And each one of those policies was kicked off and imposed at the state level, but then handed off to the faculty to work out the specifics. So, we were going to have a statewide course numbering system, but the implementation of that takes place through several hundred different faculty members from institutions and more than 100 different discipline committees who get together and talk about course equivalencies. And they find those conversations and that interinstitutional cooperation very valuable, and they learn a lot from it. And the same with the conversations about general education, that there was a certain level of resistance to it. But when you brought department chairs and faculty together to talk about what really were the core competencies that we wanted in general education in the state, I mean, that's a very important educational and philosophical conversation, and the kind of conversation that academics actually love to have. So even though the requirement initially was imposed at the state level, it ultimately turned into an exercise I don't think the faculty found too difficult or onerous.
Yeah, I mean, those kinds of, I think, conversations, you're right, were very useful. And my sense was, and of course you're much closer to it than I was struck also in Florida that the division of community colleges was having through its, IR people, lots of conversation interchange with the colleges in, trying to work out various procedures for reporting and analyzing data and building up the capacity of the individual colleges to be able to do that. And so that kind of work, I think, just struck me as very important. We see evidence of it as well in Tennessee. And what it strikes me is that, particularly with some colleges varying greatly in their size, do they have any full-time institutional research staff? How research-oriented are their faculty? That there's real evidence of considerable variation in institutions' capacity to be able to adequately respond and understand, respond, and then come up with a solution and then evaluate it to what they need to do to be able to effectively respond to performance, to accountability demands. And I think bringing that into the conversation I think is really going to be crucial. And I would love to have more of that be a central part of any discussion of, any further development and accountability.
That's true, and it's also true with enrollment-based formulas and physical facility formulas. And anytime you have a process or a formula that is fairly opaque, then it will be the larger universities and colleges with the biggest analytical or policy analysis capacity that will have an advantage, both to influence how those structures are set up and then how they respond to them. And to the point where, the big flagship universities or even a very large community college, if they have the budget where they can hire a former state budget director as an analyst or a vice president who knows things inside and out, and the little college down the street may have one person who's doing finance, IR, and teaching 2 classes, and they won't obviously have the same ability to get into the details that way. So that is something, again, having state level staff with the technical competence and the clout to provide a counterweight to that tendency, I think, is pretty important.
Do you have concluding thoughts about performance funding, quality assessment, and the completion agenda?
I was going to steal from Professor Dougherty, and so I can go first in case he was going to say this. What really struck me about what he said, I just want to pick up on that organizational learning piece. And I also, I guess I'll cheat off of Nate's paper too, because I think it has, to some extent, a connection with some of the examples that Nate was using when he talked about ways in which institutions are beginning to respond to these initiatives, that largely had to do with, in my opinion, which largely had to do with transparency and actually like getting that the advantage of some of these new rules is that it is not so much that it creates these incentives, perverse or otherwise, but that it just opens up some of the data to the light and allows people to learn from what's already being collected. And that's sort of what I think of as organizational learning. And that learning can be for the benefits of doing things, sort of current policies, but also getting back to one of your big questions. It can also be an opportunity to think about how it also gives you an opportunity to evaluate how you're being judged as an organization. That can be part of the organizational learning, and that gets you into these conversations about performance funding 3.0, right? We don't, in assessing where we are, maybe perhaps in relation to our peer institutions or between departments or whatever, we've unearthed sort of this flaw in the way we're being evaluated, and that's feedback to the next time we revisit performance funding. So those are the things that I think would need to happen to keep the momentum going.
So I would like states to think about in the initial stages of performance 3.0, transparency on the one hand, and I think the first step toward quality without necessarily having to have a robust system of pre and post assessments in place is just some attention to the mix of degrees that are being awarded at different institutions, the level, the kinds of disciplines. Not necessarily, I'm resistant to the idea of having particular weights for a physics degree or an English degree or things like that, because I think that multiplies the opportunities for gaming and perverse incentives. But just kind of keeping an eye on what kinds of graduates are coming out of the system at the same time as the numbers of completers and the service to important population groups is part of the formula as it is in Tennessee. I think the mix on the outcome side is also something that's relatively easy to keep an eye on and is an important part of quality.
I guess for me, I would love to have the kind of dialogue you're having us have continue to be expanded so that we clarify as much as possible what we mean by accountability and the theory of actions or theories of action underlying it, because I think often in the Humphreys article is getting to this is that there's a real danger that going in without a very clear idea of what, we have a sense of where we want to end up. We have a sense of the immediate policy instrument we're going to be using. We have little sense of what's going to intervene between the two of them to affect the result that we want. And I think that's where you really then get into the possibility of the perverse incentives we were talking about, but also disappointment that things aren't working out as we intend. And that part of the black box that I think is so crucial to help figure out is what indeed do we think should be occurring with institutions in order for them to be able to work effectively. So we've been talking about issues of organizational expertise and capacity, and I think just crucial to that is what are ways to effectively bring the faculty into this kind of discussion so they can effectively contribute to this. And I think that gets into relationships of institutional trust and consultation. And these are things that often seem kind of rather vague and not even entirely necessary. But that's why I returned to Tennessee as a very interesting case where I think that process of building trust and consultation was at the very center of what they were doing. I think it's had enormous payoffs for them. And I think a lot of thought should be given to that as well as part of this process. And it will be particularly important if there's a move then towards learning assessment, because then the faculty role becomes crucial. And what we've discovered is the faculty are not in effect sufficiently consulted. And you think of common course numbering, transferability of credits, and all of that. If they're not brought in effectively, there'll be ways in which those efforts will simply fail. So I think that filling in the black box of what happens within the institutions as they respond to these new systems of accountability, I think is crucial. And I hope we could spend collectively a fair amount of attention on that.